Okay, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to this Tactical Explainer, where today we are going to break down the 1898 Santiago campaign of the Spanish-American War. And we're going to approach this strictly from the objective perspective of a military historian. So, we aren't getting into the political rhetoric of the era today, we are focusing purely on the dry, hard facts of the battlefield. It's honestly a fascinating case study. You've got a conflict fought right on the cusp of the 20th century, where old-school Napoleonic-era tactics just violently collided with modern industrialized firepower. We're going to analyze exactly how this operation was planned, analyze the strategic use of the naval fleet, and really look at why the reality on the ground, especially during the infamous assault on San Juan Heights, diverged so drastically from those neat, organized maps back in the command tent. If you've ever wondered how wars are actually won when the original blueprints completely fall apart, well, this breakdown is definitely for you.
Here's a quick look at our briefing agenda. We'll cover the strategic intent in Cuba, the naval blockade, General Shafter's plan, the chaos and tactics at San Juan, and finally, evaluate the overall effectiveness of the U.S. strategy.
Section 1. Strategic Intent in Cuba. Let's look at the overarching goals the U.S. was actually trying to achieve here.
So the fundamental American strategy relied on a classic combined arms approach. Think of it like a giant vice. The primary strategic linchpin here was the Spanish naval squadron, commanded by Admiral Pascual Cervera. Now, Cervera's fleet had sought refuge in Santiago Harbor, which basically instantly made that specific port the center of gravity for the entire war effort. The idea was incredibly straightforward in theory, right? You use the overwhelming superiority of the U.S. Navy to lock down the waters, sever all the supply lines, and trap Cervera's ships inside the harbor. Simultaneously, the U.S. Army lands on the coast and squeezes the ring shut from the landward side, capturing the city of Santiago de Cuba itself. The Navy applies pressure from the sea, the Army applies pressure from the land, and the Spanish forces are crushed right in the middle.
Section 2. Naval Blockade of Cuban Ports. Let's look at how they actually disrupted those supply lines.
What's really striking here is how methodically the fleet dismantled Spanish infrastructure. This was absolutely not just some passive patrol of the waters. Look at this timeline. By April and May, vessels under Commodore McCulloch weren't just blockading Cienfuegos, they were executing highly dangerous, specialized operations. They physically cut the underwater telegraph cables linking Cuba to the outside world. I mean, just imagine the intense peril of that for a second. American sailors in small, unarmored rowboats taking heavy rifle fire from the shore, desperately trying to dredge up and hack through thick underwater communication cables using hand tools. It was incredibly hazardous, but absolutely necessary. Following that, in June, the U.S. Marines executed a brilliant operation to secure Guantanamo Bay. Why Guantanamo? Well, the blockading fleet desperately needed a secure, deep-water harbor to take on coal and, shelter from those devastating Caribbean hurricanes. From a purely military history standpoint, analyzing this naval action, the U.S. Navy executed their portion of the strategy with near-perfect efficiency.
Section 3. General Shafter's plan. Now let's transition over to the ground assault.
So with the harbor sealed by the Navy, the land campaign fell to Major General William Shafter. On a staff map, his blueprint looked like a perfectly orchestrated chess game. It relied completely on strict, rigid timing. Step 1, General Henry Lawton's division would attack the fortified village of El Caney on the right flank, and they were supposed to capture it in under 2 hours. Step 2, having brushed aside the defenders, Lawton's troops would rapidly march south and rejoin the main body of the army. Step 3, this massive, newly unified force would launch a synchronized hammer blow directly into the Spanish entrenchments at San Juan Heights. It's a beautiful theory, but the sheer hubris of assuming you can take a fortified village in under 2 hours without heavy siege artillery, that is literally a textbook recipe for a strategic breakdown.
And wow, does this ever illustrate the classic fog of war? The second the first shot was fired, Shafter's precise timetable just completely evaporated. Why? Because the 600 or so Spanish soldiers holding El Caney under General Joaquim Barra de Rey fought like absolute lions. They were dug into stone forts and wooden blockhouses, and they had zero intention of surrendering in 2 hours. Because of that, General Lawton's forces got hopelessly bogged down in a brutal, day-long firefight. And since Lawton was delayed, the entire central grouping of the American Army was thrown into total disarray. Communications completely failed. Orders arrived late or, honestly, not at all. And the assault on the main objective, San Juan Heights, started without its critical right flank support. It just morphed into this disjointed, uncoordinated crawl directly under the sights of Spanish Mauser rifles.
Section 4. Chaos and Tactics at San Juan.
The situation on the ground swiftly deteriorated into a total tactical nightmare, specifically in a horribly congested staging area the soldiers grimly nicknamed Hell's Pocket. Try to imagine the terrifying reality for the infantry here. They are funneling down these narrow jungle trails, wading through dense, chest-high tropical grass. They have practically zero visibility of what's ahead, but the Spanish defenders, sitting up high in elevated trenches, can see the grass moving perfectly. And to make this horrific bottleneck even worse, actually, it's almost hard to believe. The U.S. Army deployed an observation balloon to spot artillery targets, and they tethered it right above the advancing American troops. Instead of providing useful intel, it basically acted as a giant floating bullseye. It essentially told the Spanish artillery, hey, drop your shrapnel right here. The advancing troops were just absolutely pinned to the earth by a merciless crossfire.
You know, when rigid top-down plans shatter like this, a military force survives solely on the aggressive initiative of its local commanders. This incredible quote captures the desperate spirit of that exact moment. It's from Major General Joseph Wheeler. And what's absolutely wild about Wheeler is that he was a former Confederate cavalry general. A man who had spent his youth fighting against the United States Army during the Civil War was now commanding a U.S. cavalry division in a blue uniform. Even while suffering from a severe tropical fever, Wheeler relied on his old aggressive instincts. He absolutely refused to stay pinned down and urged his troops forward. This willingness of the junior and mid-level officers to just seize control and ignore the paralyzed chain of command was literally the only spark of hope left in that jungle.
By 1 p.m. on July 1st, the entire American assault had completely flatlined. The crisis point was here. Officers and enlisted men alike were baking in this extreme, suffocating tropical heat, taking massive casualties and hiding in the brush at the base of San Juan and Kettle Hills. The Spanish defensive lines were largely unbroken. This was the razor's edge of the entire campaign. The troops were facing a brutal mathematical reality. They either had to find a way to charge straight up a heavily defended hill into blistering crossfire, or they'd be forced into a humiliating and bloody retreat, completely abandoning General Shafter's ground operation.
So, the crucial point we really need to understand here is that it was not some brilliant tactical maneuver from a general's tent that finally broke the Spanish lines. It was the raw, devastating application of sheer firepower. Lieutenant John H. Parker made a bold, totally unorthodox decision. He pushed his battery of Gatling guns far up to the front lines. Now, Gatling guns were traditionally thought of as heavy defensive weapons, but Parker used them offensively. He unleashed a continuous, shrieking sheet of lead directly into the Spanish trenches at the top of the hill. This overwhelming covering fire forced the Spanish defenders to keep their heads down, drastically reducing the incoming rifle fire. And that brief window of suppression was exactly what was needed. That covering fire was the literal game changer that allowed Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders and the elite African-American Buffalo Soldiers to make their historic, unstoppable charge right up those slopes.
Section 5. Evaluating U.S. Strategy Effectiveness. Let's assess how this all actually played out.
Acting as military analysts, when we evaluate the ultimate effectiveness of the U.S. strategy at San Juan and across the campaign, we are left with a pretty stark contrast. The naval aspect of the campaign executed magnificently. They isolated the operational theater, secured their logistics bases, and fundamentally neutralized the enemy fleet. However, the top-level land planning was essentially a masterclass in how not to run a campaign. General Shafter created a brittle plan that had zero flexibility. Poor reconnaissance and terrible logistics just marched the army right into a meat grinder. The undeniable truth is that the ground operation succeeded in spite of its high command. The day was saved entirely by the sheer bravery of the frontline troops, the on-the-fly initiative of field officers, and the devastating tactical application of heavy infantry weapons at the exact right second.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final thought. Consider this question carefully. You know, history books often package military victories as the inevitable result of brilliant, sweeping master plans. But the harsh reality of warfare, as we've clearly seen today in the jungles of Cuba, is that there is very often an incredibly thin, chaotic line separating a total tactical disaster from a historic triumph. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the realities of the battlefield. We'll see you on the next explainer.